When do you use the nested if statement or multiple branch statement versus separate if statements? When do you use each of those? Now, the nested or multiple branch if statements are used when the user has only one option, or there's only one choice for the if statement. If you use radio buttons, for example, users can only select one option for those radio buttons. In this case, what you might want to say is, do you agree with this statement? I love programming. The user can select one of these options. The user shouldn't be able to select yes and no, so that's why you use radio buttons. By default, those are set up to where you can only choose one. In this case, we're going to check the yes radio button to see if it's selected. If it's selected, the value is true. The same for the no. If it's selected, the value of the no radio button will be true. And the same here for the not sure yet. So if the user selects yes, then we don't need to check these two, right? So if yes is not selected, then it will go down and check the next radio button, which is no. If it's true or if it's selected, it will drop out. It doesn't need to check this one. If it checks this one and it's not selected, it will go to this one. If it's not selected, by default, it will assume that this one is selected because you only have those three choices. So that's what we're looking at. And the code I have here is loose code, we'll call it that. It's somewhat simplified for the radio buttons. But let's just say, for the logic, if the yes radio button is true, if it's selected, then we're going to print, I'm glad you enjoyed programming. And if that is true, it will cut out of the if block and execute whatever the next lines are. If the radio button for yes is not selected, meaning it's false, it's automatically going to go down to the next line in the if statement that is an else if. It will execute this and see if the no radio button is checked, if it's true. If it is, it will execute this line and then drop out of the if block. If this is not true, if it's not selected, it will go down to the final else and execute this statement, assuming that if you have not checked the first two, that this one is the only other option that would be selected. So if you look at the if statement, it's going to check the options, but if something is true, it's going to execute the statement below it and then drop out of the if statement, assuming that the other two do not need to be checked, since you can only select one radio button. Let's look at the separate if statements now. These are used when there are multiple options that can be selected. In this case, I'm going to use checkboxes as the options that the user has, because the checkboxes are set up to where you can select more than one of the options. In this example, which topic have you studied in IT or topics, you can select one or you can select multiple items. If you used a nested if statement, like what we just talked about, what it will do is check this first checkbox, and if it's selected, meaning if it's true, it will execute whatever statement is below that. For example, add to the number of students who have taken web development, and then it will cut out and execute the line below the if function. So it will not check these items. You can use separate if statements that will select each item and check it to see if the user has selected it or not. In that case, you will have 4 if statements here to check each individual box. In the code, and again, this is loose code. I just wanted to add it in here for the logic so that you would understand the concepts. So I've got each of these checkboxes. If the web development checkbox is true, meaning that it's selected, we're going to add to the development count to get a number of how many students have taken web development classes or workshops. So we're going to add 1 to that count. The next if statement will check to see if the database development checkbox is true. If it is, then it will go ahead and add 1 to the number of students that is taken database. And again, it will go to the next if statement and execute the code there. If the ITS security checkbox is true, it will add 1 to that count of students. And then it will select or check the Python to see if it's true. If it is, it's going to add 1 to the Python count. And that should be a plus sign right there. Let's go back through this. Let's just say we have the database development and the Python programming development checked. It will go through this statement and it's not true, so it will skip down to the next statement and check database development. That's true, it's selected, so it will add 1 to the database development count. Note that this was not selected, so it was false. It did not add 1 to the web development count. Then we'll check the ITS security, and if it's false, if it's not selected, it will skip the statement and go down to the Python checkbox. It is true, it's been selected, so it will add 1 to the count for Python students. Again, if you used nested if statements where you had else, and else, it would check each box, and if web development was true, it would ignore all of these other statements and go to the statement that's after the if block of statements. So that's the difference in using the nested or multiple if branch statements and using the separate or single if statements.